Jump through Exodus. Last week, we kind of did an overview of the whole book. So we looked at some of the Bible Project video, and we talked about the historical method in relation to Exodus and how historians and Egyptologists would kind of check in on the Exodus story. So I wanted to do our own check-in in light of what we looked at last week and see how everyone is sitting with what we covered last week before we kind of move forward chapter by chapter. Did you have any burning thoughts this week?
Only what I read this week.
Do what?
Only what I read this week.
Only for what you read this week? Okay, well that was the next question of any burning questions or thoughts of what we are going to look at today.
Well, Moses wrestling with God, trying to say I'm not good enough against somebody else, all on and on, back and forth, and God finally said, well, I'll get your brother Aaron to help you. And then Moses says, well, okay, I'll do that.
So we are going to have a slide of that. There are 4 big things that Moses argues against what God's calling him to do. And he keeps having excuses, and eventually Aaron goes along with him. We have like 3 little slides, I think, on that section. Any other upcoming questions for what we are going to look at, chapters 1 through 5? Okay. I always love it when people have like really, really hard questions. Oh, if y'all remember, did Adam have a belly button question came up this week. Someone asked me.
Really?
On the internet, of all places.
Well, did he?
I always find like those to be, I've talked about that in here, like when I taught middle school youth at another church before here, and the whole day was spent, did Adam have a belly button? That was the whole conversation. And I've always just thought questions like that, they miss so much. They're just like a worthless question. Like it's fun to have silly questions sometimes. Yeah. But it was like a serious debate for like an hour with these group of middle schoolers, which is now when I teach things, I try to avoid questions such as that, where we can kind of look at what the author is trying to lead us to, not questions like that. So this is our journey through the Bible, and here we are going to explore through Exodus, because I'm very creative with names. And I want to show you, so on my website, if you go to Journey Through the Bible, you can see each of the little sections we've looked at thus far. So if you want to go back and see what we talked about with Genesis, for all the recordings that actually worked, you can find all of them. And same for last week. And as we go through Exodus, you can find last week's recording. And then all of these, you can see the videos we looked at last week, as well as the presentation and the handouts that we have. So in the little email announcements, it'll have a link to this portal so that you can find everything there. And as long as the recording works, the recording will be there. So as we are going to kind of work our way through Exodus, I want to keep this idea in mind. And we talked about this last week, which is oftentimes people will kind of bring points of view that when you study the scripture, you have to be against each other in 2 types of camps. That you either study scripture academically or you look at it devotionally. And what we're going to keep trying to do is fight against that. We are not kind of competing with each other. We want to look academically into the scripture because that actually helps us read it devotionally. When we can actually dig in and get to the author's point of view, we will suddenly begin to see the points that they are trying to flesh out. And for me, at least, and I think it's true for most people, it helps the text kind of blossom and be a little bit fuller. And so, do you remember the example I gave of this last week? We gave 2 examples. One was in Genesis and one was with Jesus in the triumphal entry. So we gave the example that triumphal entry of Jesus is actually compared to 2 relevant events.
Yes.
One of them was Maccabees, who came into Jerusalem on a war horse, and they laid down their robes, and they had palm branches, and they said, Hosanna in the highest, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And then Maccabees cleansed out the temple and restored correct worship to God. So he kind of kicked out the Greeks or the Macedonians because they conquered into Israel. And the other story is on that same very week, and on the opposite gate, Pilate was coming into Jerusalem on a war horse, on a military parade. And so when you're presented the details about Jesus, with the same, it uses the same lines from the Maccabee story, and it tells us the week and what gate, suddenly I know, oh, this is actually competing against the Maccabee story in Pilate. The difference being Jesus isn't coming on a war horse. So he's coming to restore worship like Maccabees, and he's coming against war and against empire like Pilate. And so now I know this devotional aspect. Maybe God's calling us into that same thing, into correct worship, not by force, but out of love and an offering of ourselves, and not for violence on a war horse. So the other thing we want to keep in mind is most of those stories, they're either going to come from Egypt or they're going to come from Mesopotamia. And it just so happens today we're going to look at a story from both of these that are going to kind of influence some of Moses' birth story and ending up in the Nile. And we looked at like a brief overview. So I updated our picture. This is the picture that I made because I'm not that artistically talented, but here it is. So Exodus, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of... Oh, it still says Israel.
It does.
Egypt. Wait, did I went through and changed these. Wait, is this last week's?
Yeah.
Oh, this might be last week's. No, it's not. What's going on here? Okay, well, these other ones say Egypt. Ignore that for right now. That's funny. I thought I fixed all of those. Okay. So I fixed them all except this one. I was seeing if you were paying attention or something. So Exodus we talked about in the Tanakh, which is the Hebrew Bible, is called Shemot. And Shemot means names. And that's just how the book of Exodus starts. And so that's what they call it, Shemot. And we talked about the author of Exodus. So it's primarily made up of two different sources. One is priestly, and one is non-priestly. And if you want to get more into detail, that non-priestly is the Elohist source. And we're not going to get as much into the weeds about that in Exodus as we did in Genesis. And we talked about there's all these different themes that are going to pop up. Covenant. Covenant pops up in Genesis, and it will keep popping up throughout the whole Bible. And salvation. And we talked about what salvation means a little bit. Salvation's bigger than just being saved. It's this idea of justice for the whole community. And so we're going to see the salvation of all of Israel, or for all of the Hebrews. And we're going to see big displays of God's power, particularly in the next couple of weeks when the 10 plagues happen. And it's almost like Yahweh is up against all the Egyptian gods. And each of the plagues kind of knock down one of the Egyptian gods. And then we're going to run into the scene today where we're going to see Yahweh, I am that I am, the great name. And we're going to talk about this and watch a video on that as well. And the other part that we talked about is that Exodus was written for exiled Jews in the 6th century BCE. So this is when they themselves are in exile. And so Exodus is written to bring hope to a people that are in exile, a people that are experiencing oppression, and a people that are looking forward to freedom. And this story has become somewhat of a universal story. And we mentioned some of these last week, but in particular for Black theology and liberation theology, the story of the Exodus becomes very powerful. Because God isn't a God that's just there to rescue the Jewish people or the Hebrew people. God is a God that rescues all oppressed persons. And so anyone experiencing oppression, anyone experiencing slavery, anyone experiencing harsh times, this story becomes the main foundational story of all of Scripture. And then we played this song, which I'm going to play just
We see you, the
a little bit.
outside-the-box dreamers,
Is this too loud?
the doers, the feelers.
Yeah.
Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God said He's gonna jump in the water. Wade in the water, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. God's gonna jump in the water. We have the sons and the daughters.
So we played this last week. This is a very popular song in this area. Like all the high schoolers will always sing this song.
Really?
It really like blew my mind that only 2 of you all last week had heard this before. And well, and Jim said that the choir sings it every year. And so,
In a particular
I think maybe during Black History Month would be when I would think they would sing it. And I think they did Bliss in February. I think they did this past year. So it's a really popular song. So though the tune is different. Here we go. Look at this. I brought you out of Egypt. There we go. So this is our outline of Exodus. So if you're a Jew and you go to synagogue, they have a lectionary for what they read through each week. And we're going to follow their lectionary for how we're going to read Exodus. And so this first part is the Shemot, or the names in English, chapters 1 through 5. That's what we just read and what we'll cover this week. And we talked about there's a few different ways to make an outline. And so I like this idea of putting Exodus into 3 parts, just because it makes it easier to kind of break down and read. Most scholars will put Exodus into 2 parts. So there's the first half, 1 through 18. There's the second half, 20 through 40. And then chapter 19 is the middle. And that's when the covenant is given at Mount Sinai. And so if you really want to, like a quick way to memorize Exodus, it's like that. 1 through 18, 20 through 40. Chapter 19 is Sinai in the middle. And that first half is going to cover Israel, or the Hebrews, in Egypt, and the Exodus, and the wandering through the desert. And that second half is going to cover all the laws and such given in the covenant. But there's another way that we can break it down. We gave this out as a handout last week, and it is up on the little website portal as well. The other thing that we talked about is how historians would count the story of Exodus. And so they use something called the historical method. And there are 5 kind of main questions that are at least relevant for the Exodus story. And that's when we look at a text. And so the first thing that we ask when we're looking at a text or a story that we can find is, does that match the archaeological record? And so when we're in dig sites, we can usually find certain evidence that might give toward a story or not toward a story. And what we looked at for Exodus is that according to the Exodus story and in Numbers, there would be about 2 million people. And there is not only a lack of evidence for 2 million people leaving Egypt, wandering through a desert, and showing up in Canaan. There's actually evidence to the opposite of that. We also ask if there are multiple sources that all tell the same story. There's like 7 different versions of the Moses story going around that are all a little bit different. But there all is a Moses that did something in Egypt and rescued some people. And then we ask, is there a chance that that source would be biased? Religious texts are a prime example of a source that we would call biased, because you're writing to tell a particular point. That doesn't make it bad, it's just that you're writing for a particular reason. We also ask how much time has passed from when the event took place to when it's written. For the story of Moses, it's about 1,000 years. And then we ask what genre is being used. We didn't talk about this last point, but we've talked before just about how ancient biographies are written, or ancient stories with mythologies, that they kind of craft other stories together to tell a point. And usually, for Scripture, they're telling a theological point. They want us to know something about God. And what we learn about God in the story of Exodus is God is a God who cares for people experiencing oppression. And God is a God who sticks to his promises. And is more powerful than any other gods out there. We talked about that last week, so I'm not going to continue on that point. These are some sources I really like. I'm a big fan of the NRSV Bible. They recently updated it to the creatively named NRSV UE, which is the updated edition. They're about as good at naming things as I am. It's New Revised Standard Version Updated Edition. And it's like really boring. I also really love Robert Alter. And so there are some points I will bring some printouts of a particular story. And or of a text. I will do that from Robert Alter's translation. His translation does really well at matching the poetry in the Hebrew. So when we first started Genesis, we only read from Robert Alter for the first few chapters. And then occasionally I would bring it in And I think the last one was when Abraham gives the blessing to all the sons. Not Abraham, when Jacob gives the blessing to all the sons. And it was like a big poem that was written. And you miss it in English translations. So I really like Robert Alter's translation. And he has really great footnotes that explain why he makes his translation choices. And so sometimes it's really good to read it. For study Bibles, so I am never without my Oxford Annotated study Bible. There's also a HarperCollins. Marcia, I think you have.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there are two, when you go to a seminary, they either recommend you get this one, or they recommend this one that Marcia has, the HarperCollins. I've just always had this one. And I also like, if you want a free source, the NET Bible. So it's the NET Bible. They made it for an internet age. And the translation, there's nothing great about it, but it has really great notes. And so, it has fabulous notes, pages and pages of notes on one, per chapter. I mean, it's just really great. And then books I really like, or other sources, is like the Bible Project, that we will continue to play videos.
Oh, very late, teacher.
So, for chapters 1 through 5 that we are going to look at today, this is that first kind of section for the Jewish lectionary of Exodus. And we're going to cover the Hebrews' affliction in Egypt. We're going to look at this part about Moses, where he's hidden in the river, and then he's kind of rescued by the Egyptians. We're going to look then at Moses fleeing Egypt and ending up in Midian. We're going to see how he is called, and then he is going to go back before Pharaoh. And I'll just say, when I read this section, I didn't realize Exodus moved so fast. For some reason, I thought Exodus was a lot slower. In these first 5 chapters, I was like, wow, I feel like that was half the book, or something like that. And I see a head shake. Is that true for others?
A lot of big stories there.
No, it was. Yeah, I was like, wow, it went much quicker than I remember it being when I was younger. So before we kind of move in, and we're going to read the first 2 chapters, any parts that stood out, besides the ones we mentioned earlier about Moses giving his objections. Not yet. Well, let's go ahead and begin reading. Here you go. Susan, if you could get us started, we're going to read chapters 1 and 2, and then we're going to discuss them. And let's just look, if you would read until you are tired of reading, and then we'll move on.
Starting with 1.
Yep, yeah, in verse 1.
These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob, each with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. The total number of people born to Jacob were 70. Joseph was already in Egypt. Then Joseph died, and all his brothers and that whole generation. But the Israelites were fruitful and prolific. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. I'm through.
Great with the names, Susan.
I could not.
Yes.
Yeah, good job. All right, the Israelites are oppressed. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. He said to his people, "Look, the Israelite people are more numerous and more powerful than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in the event of war, join our enemies and fight against us and escape from the land." Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramesses for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so that the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites and made their lives bitter with hard service in mortar and brick and in every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks that they imposed on them.
The king of Egypt Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of them was named Shiphrah, and the other Pura. Anyway, if you want to correct me.
I don't know either.
When you act as midwives to the Hebrew woman and see them on the birth stool, if it is a boy, kill him, but if it is a girl, she shall live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and said to them, "Why have you done this and allowed the boys to live?" The midwives said to Pharaoh, "Because the Hebrew women are not like the Egyptian women, for they are vigorous and give birth before the midwife comes to them." So God dealt with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families. Then Pharaoh commanded all his people, "Every boy that is born in the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live."
Bill, could you start us in chapter 2?
Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son. When she saw that he was a fine baby, she hid him 3 months. And when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and plastered it with bitumen and pitch. She put the child in it and placed it among the reeds on the bank of the river. His sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. While her attendants walked beside the river, she saw the basket among the reeds and sent the maids to bring it in. When she opened it, she saw the child. She was crying, and she took pity on him. He was crying, and she took pity on him. "This must be one of the Hebrew children," she said. Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew women to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's mother said to her, "Take this child and nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses because, she said, "I drew him out of the water."
One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to his people and saw their forced labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his kinsfolk. He looked this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. When he went out the next day, he saw 2 Hebrews fighting, and he said to the one who was in the wrong, "Why do you strike your fellow Hebrew?" He answered, "Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moses was afraid and thought, "Surely the thing is known." When Pharaoh heard of it, he sought to kill Moses.
But Moses fled from Pharaoh. He settled in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. The priest of Midian had 7 daughters. They came to draw water and filled the troughs to water their father's flock. But some shepherds came and drove them away. Moses got up and came to their defense and watered their flock. When they returned to their father's well, he said, "How is it that you have come back so soon today?" They said, "An Egyptian helped us against the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." He said to his daughters, "Where is he? Why did you leave the man? Invite him to break bread." Moses agreed to stay with the man, and he gave Moses his daughter Zipporah in marriage. She bore a son, and he named him Gershom, for he said, "I have been an alien resident in a foreign land."
After a long time, the king of Egypt died. The Israelites groaned under their slavery and cried out. Out of the slavery, their cry help rose up out of their cry for help rose up to God. God heard their groaning, and God remembered this covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God looked upon the Israelites, and God took notice of them.
Fun story. And a lot happens in those first 2 chapters. One of the kind of breakdowns of Moses' life, if you want to think about it kind of in a fun way, is he spent 40 years in Egypt, then he spends 40 years in Midian, or kind of not in Egypt, and then 40 years after the Exodus wandering through the desert. Kind of a fun way to break up his lifespan. Also makes you think, I don't want to be 100 years old marching through the desert for 20 more years with a hot sun beating down on you. So Exodus 1 begins with this list of descriptions, which Susan fabulous job saying all of their names. And there's an importance in some of the number. Can you guess what that might be? Yeah, well, there's 12. There's a mention of 12 tribes, but in the number 70.
$7.
Oh, wait, hold on. Don't get to the $7 yet, because that's going to pop. I think that's my next slide, or the next chapter at least.
Well, they started with 70 and ended up with 3 million.
Well, yeah, first we grow really, really quick. Also, this number 70 is a symbolic number, and we talked about this at the end of Genesis. So it's 7 and 10. And whenever there's like a numeral of 7, that's always a very, very special number. 7 represents completeness or wholeness. And so we have this number saying it's all of the Hebrews. It's all the important ones that matter are here. And so 70 is one of those kind of special numbers. And sometimes the list of who is in that 70 is a little different, but each of those lists are special. And what's special about this list is that there's some women that are going to pop up kind of in the numbering that's going to happen here. And so Bill's comment about there being 7 daughters, if you want to have fun, try to count how many women are mentioned in the first 2 chapters, because it's going to be a fun number. So the first thing to note about this, what happens is there's this list of all the numbers, and then there's the list of the descendants that are going to come, and then they're here in the land of Egypt, and they're gonna be fruitful and multiply, and they grow kind of to be a pretty big number. When we hear that line, which doesn't come across as well in the NRSV, they were fruitful and multiply. What's it make you think of?
Genesis.
Makes you think back to Genesis, the first mandate. Be fruitful and multiply and spread across the earth. And so immediately I'm driven back to, these are God's people. They're fruitful and they're multiplying. God is blessing them in the land that they're in. They are taking part of God's covenant, which is to be fruitful and multiply. But because of that, the Egyptians are scared, so they enslave them and they force them into hard labor. As a note about that, oftentimes when you're a big empire and there's a ethnic minority, you would force them into forced labor or into hard labor. Usually that labor wasn't specialized, so a lot of people have when I was a kid, I always thought the Israelites were the ones that built the pyramids or something like that, but those are really specialized jobs, and it would be kind of different than what forced labor would be for. Here in the story, they make bricks, which is pretty simple work. You take mud and straw, and then you let it dry out in the sun. It kind of ends, chapter 1 at least, with Pharaoh ordering the killing of all these Israelite boys.
Yes.
Why would Pharaoh want to kill the Israelite boys? He has more slaves if he doesn't kill them.
Well, yes.
But they turn
So-
into soldiers.
Come back to that. So Pharaoh in this story is being pictured as the epitome of evil. You can't get worse. Another line, and you might not pick up on it as much, but the way that Exodus starts, it sounds very it is unclear in history. It never gives a name to Pharaoh. And so it says there is a new king in Egypt. And a lot of stories when they'll start off that are kind of have a shadow of mythology around them will start off with unclear details. It never names what reign of the king it's in. It never names specific details, but it describes his character. And we get the idea that he's a bad guy. And so if you remember back in Genesis, it gives this description of Lamech. Do you remember Lamech? He was like the first bad guy after Cain. So he was the son of Cain. And the first bad thing he does is he takes more than one wife. And then the second bad thing that he does is he kills a man and laughs. And so he's like worse than Cain because he marries more people and he laughs when he kills people. And so here we're getting a picture like we have escalated from killing one person to laughing at killing one person to killing lots of people and not thinking twice. And so far in the biblical story, Pharaoh is as bad as it could get. He is enslaving other people. The idea with this is he's making monuments to himself for his own worship, and he just kills people without thinking about it. So he kills them because he's a bad guy, but also to stop them from growing too strong.
The killing of the Israelite baby boys reminds me of the Passover, where they put blood on the doors to keep the baby boys from being killed.
That is an interesting reversal on that story. I saw it.
Are you going to come back to the numerology of the women?
Yeah, in chapter 2, we're going to come to that. I'm interested to hear if you have thoughts on that. Rachel really likes numbers. This is also a kind of trope of bad kings that will be repeated a lot, not only in the biblical narrative, but you kill off baby boys. I guess because you're not bad enough to kill baby girls. I've never quite gotten that, but
The boys are more dangerous.
I guess boys can be
They
soldiers.
multiply,
So
And they can be soldiers.
The women can't multiply without the men.
yeah, but you only need one man.
That's why
But I guess that's because he can't come up and be soldiers and kind of take over that way.
Can't do that.
The one part I do want to point out in here, so we talked about the number 70, a special number of completion.
Can I ask a question about that again? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
So you said about the killing of the boys is not bad enough to kill the girls. Do you think it has anything to do with, like, there were Hebrew laws that technically punished, in our view, the woman for having a female child? The time of laying in was twice as long. You were unclean for twice as long as if you had a male child.
I think
So you're
So
sort of
the-
honored as a woman to have a male son, like you have a son. So I wonder if it is drawing anything between
I
the
think
two that there's
those-
more honor.
both might be drawing from the cultural norms, where
Mhm.
men are the ones that not only extend family, but they're the ones that become soldiers.
Okay.
And so that is not an unusual case for baby boys to be killed, like in a city or something like that, because it stops a population from rising up. Also, in the ancient world, like boys die from war, but women die in childbirth, and so like there would be more men unless there's a war than there would be girls, which is one reason why men would marry multiple times as well. So sad bad guy. He's a bad guy. One thing to note though is he's unnamed, so there's like a mythological air about him. So he is the representation of what it means to be evil. And so when you read this story, read it as anyone can be this bad king. And so this is kind of any authority figure taking advantage of other people, oppressing other persons, and such. So this is Pharaoh is stand-in for bad kings, bad rulers, for empire. Forced labor, as we said, was something normal. There's a mention of 2 cities, Pithom and Ramses. For archaeology people, we don't know where those are. We think we have some ideas, but we've never dug up these cities or found clear mentions of them. But there's also this phrase, Pharaoh says, "I don't fear your God." And so there's this idea for fearing God, that is, when you know a God and you fear that God, you respect that God. What we're going to see with Pharaoh is Pharaoh puts himself against the Hebrew God, against Yahweh. And he starts with that line of, "I don't fear your God." And we're going to see that pop up more. And then the babies are killed into the Nile, which is going to introduce us to Moses in chapter 2. Do I want to get to this part now? Yeah, we do. Okay, so one thing we did in Genesis is we would do our comparative myth. And so there are two kind of comparative myth stories that are going to lay over the birth of Moses and kind of how Moses' life begins, which is this being thrown into the Nile River. So the first is the legend of Sargon of Akkadian. And so Acadia was a kind of very early Mesopotamian empire, and Sargon is the king who establishes this empire and makes it what it is. If you want a comparison to Sargon, think Alexander the Great. So if you're an ancient empire, you want to be like Sargon. And so other kings would try to emulate him, and they would try to find connections to him, because he was not only the first king of a great empire, but he was well respected, well loved by the people. And there is this text floating around that's called the Legend of Sargon, and here's a picture of that tablet. And in that story, it kind of tells us about him. So he was a Mesopotamian king, but his father is unknown. His mom was a priestess. And for certain reasons, she puts him in the river. And the way it describes the way he's put in the river is he's in a basket of reeds. And the text has like what glue they put on it, and it sounds very similar to Moses. And he ends up floating down the Mesopotamian river. I think it's the Euphrates. And there, one of the king's gardeners catches him, and he is raised then in a kingly court. Because this other person raises him, he becomes well educated and pretty strong. And eventually he overthrows the bad king, and he becomes the king. And people really liked him. He was seen as kind of, one as the common man, because he wasn't born in the court, even though he was raised in the court. And a lot of scholars will draw similarities to Sargon in the story of Moses. And some of the similarities, if you want to go down that rabbit hole, is he was a good king, and he was one of the people, which is kind of like Moses. There's some similarities in that. Sargon was about 2500 BCE, which is about 1,000 years before Moses. But we find the tablets not until the 600s BCE, which is about the same time that the story of Exodus was written. So there's not archaeological written text before Moses, even though he was born before Moses. This might be a little bit of a stretch to draw those connections, but one that really is interesting, and I find this quite powerful to think about, is the Egyptian god Horus. And so Horus's mom was Isis, and the long story short, there was a fight among the gods. There was two bad gods and two good gods. The only bad god that matters is Seth, and the only good god that matters is Isis. But Isis gives birth to Horus. And Seth is Horus's uncle, and he wants to kill him because he has been born. And so Isis puts him in a basket of reeds, and line by line matches almost exactly to what happens with Moses as he goes through the waters. And she puts him in there, and he ends up surviving. And what ends up happening is that Horus becomes the god of all kings. And so Pharaoh is actually an embodiment of Horus, is how he was understood in the Egyptian world. But what's really interesting is how in the Exodus story, it subverts this myth about Horus. So a Pharaoh is supposed to be good like Horus, not bad like Seth, who was the old king. And in the biblical narrative, the way it presents Pharaoh in Moses is that Moses is actually more like Horus, and Pharaoh takes the place of Seth, is the bad king. And so in the descriptions about here, it really takes this Egyptian story and flips it upside down, which I just find to be really, really cool. And Horus was seen as a good character for the Egyptians. And it takes, there's something called an exposed child myth. If you look it up, you'll find all of these old stories. But there's only two where they are exposed. So the child is abandoned and thrown into a river or out in the air or whatever it is. It's usually because people don't want the kid. But there's only two stories where they do it to save them, and that's with Moses and with Horus. And so there's a lot of similarities in this stories, but the only part that matters is this story here in Exodus 1 and 2, it captures the Horus story, flips it upside down. Moses is good, Pharaoh is bad. So Pharaoh has rejected his God-given right to be a good Pharaoh. And so Moses is here to replace him.
When Exodus was written, it just intentionally takes those stories that at that time were well known
Yes.
and,
Yeah.
and replaces them.
So if you were reading this, particularly this part about Moses going in the river, you would go, oh, that sounds like Horus.
Okay,
But then you're like, wait, but something's different because Pharaoh's bad. Oh, Moses is the good king.
okay.
And
So
Pharaoh's
that's
the
done
bad king.
intentionally.
Yes, very intentionally. And that is how often ancient stories are written. It's an apologetic against this, against Egypt kings and bad kings.
So that's more proof that probably Moses, the story isn't real. Like we
I
were talking
would
about
say,
at the end of last week.
Like, I think there's pretty clear historical evidence and precedent that there was someone named Moses that rescued the Hebrew peoples from Egyptian influence. But at least the details in this, I don't know about that part. But I do know that it sounds very similar to this story, in that as an author, they would often do this to make points like this.
Where is that found? What you're talking about here, I've never read that.
So if you're an Egyptologist,
Yeah.
and so like my degree is in religious studies, and I studied ancient Near Eastern religions. So my background was to look at these things, which is usually why whenever I teach Bible stories, I look for these connections, because it's just the way my brain thinks. But if you looked up the story of Horus, and you can even look up the parallels, and a lot of study Bibles, I don't think this one will point out a lot of those parallels. Sometimes they kind of glance over them if they're for a more kind of Christian audience. But if you're like doing like a doctrine of theology or something like that, you would probably cover some of these, or any kind of like biblical studies that the academic.
The rest of us folks.
You cover these
I
classes.
don't feel like I've ever been exposed to that, I guess.
Probably not.
No.
Yeah,
Mm-mm.
probably not.
It's very interesting.
And the other part of that too is when you're teaching something in a church, it can be easy to look at this and get distracted from the point. And so like it took, like for this class, a lot of rapport and weeks to get to sharing things like this. And I wouldn't like go up like on a Sunday morning and talk about this either, because it's something like that you have to sit in and talk about. But it's the way ancient peoples would write. It doesn't make it wrong. It's just a different way of writing with the points. And to me, I read it as an apologetic against the Egyptian gods. It's using their stories and subverting them into it, and saying something about how God is the good God, not Pharaoh, God's people.
It seems to add another layer to this, another dimension or something.
Yeah. And I think it's exciting. So let's look a little, well, before we move past that, any more comments on this part? We won't do as much comparative myth in Exodus. We will do a little bit when we get to the plagues. Do you say thank you? So each of the plagues, though, are one of the Egyptian gods. And so it really is a battle of the gods. And so we will look at the other gods
Well,
for
does
the 10 plagues.
that mean the Gospels have comparative stories too?
Yeah, well, like the triumphal entry, it's picking up on these other two stories, and it's flipping them upside down. And same like when Matthew opens up, it begins with Herod killing all the baby boys. There is no archaeological evidence of that. There was no historian would say there was a great killing of baby boys throughout all of the Roman Empire, or even in Palestine. But when I hear that story, I'm immediately brought back to this.
Well,
And the rest of it goes through the story of Exodus.
is there evidence that they killed the boys in Exodus that is true, but it's not true with?
There's no evidence of a large Israelite presence in Egypt.
Well, there
But
were only
kings
two
did kill
midwives.
babies.
So
I want to say too, midwives. So that might be a mistranslation, that it was Hebrew midwives, and it should be
Oh.
midwives to the Hebrews, but they're actually Egyptians.
okay.
So if you're reading it going, well, why would a Hebrew kill other Hebrew boys? Well, it might have been the midwife to the Egyptian, or to the Hebrews,
Yeah.
but they would have been Egyptian.
That's what I read, but I don't know why I interpreted it that way.
That they were for them?
That they were.
Well, some then they first say Hebrew midwives, and then the next line they say when you act as a midwife to the Hebrews.
Right.
And that's the NRSV's way of doing both.
Kind of makes it more powerful that it says God blesses them with their own families.
Yeah.
That makes it more powerful if you think that
Anyone,
they're Egyptian women.
Yeah.
and we talked about that last time with God is working everywhere.
Mhm.
And so we're only looking at one way God's working, but God does lots of things. And sometimes they pop up. Let's jump into chapter 2, even though we kind of glanced through some of it. So does anyone remember why the Levites are special? They are the priestly tribe. And so there's a very clear point that Moses' parents are both Levites. And so I'm already, when I hear that, I go, oh, Moses is going to be a man of God because he was born from 2 Levites. He is from the priestly tribe. He goes down the river, and Pharaoh's daughter raises her as her own, and there he becomes well educated. He learns the ways of court and becomes well fed, so he would be stronger, more healthy than one of the Hebrews. But there are 2 episodes that happen where he kind of has a connection with the Hebrew people. One of them, he kills an Egyptian taskmaster, and the other, he is trying to kind of settle a debate between 2 Hebrews that are fighting. These are going to foreshadow to later parts of Moses, his care and his leadership for the Hebrew people. And there, he's going to go to Midian. And so, wait, is that on the next slide? No, I don't. So Midian is a country in northern Arabia, and it is where Moses and his wife Keturah would be like the ancestors of Midian. But there he finds a priest named Jethro, or Hobab, or Ruel. All of the different sources, even in Exodus, will give him different names. And so, but he is a priest of God, but in Midian, which is kind of cool. And there he marries a Midianite. So what's really cool about this, so there's some really fun numbers going on with the women in the story, which is something I never knew about Exodus until like the past 2 weeks, is that women play a very prominent and special part. First is like just Moses' sister is the most mentioned woman in all the Bible, which, again, did not know that. And she is going to have a prominent role. We're going to see glimpses of her today. And also Moses' mom. So she is the 3rd in line of 12 women. And so with the 7 daughters that are born to Jethro, it's going to make 12 women. And so you have your completion of women. And so, woohoo, feminism. And so it does stand out here. It's pretty clear in the Exodus text. There is a giving of power to women. Not only with them as midwives, but just kind of throughout the whole story. Also, just a note about Moses' name. So it's actually an Egyptian name. And we didn't talk about that. A lot of Levites have Egyptian names, where the other tribes of Israel have Canaanite names. And so Moses, from the Egyptian root, it means is born. But here it's given a kind of extra layer of Hebrew name that's he who is drawn out. And we talked about that in Genesis. Oftentimes names will have more than one meaning, and from the different sources they'll have two meanings that go along with them. And just if you're curious, there's a lot of other Egyptian names with Moses in it that Egyptologists kind of root back the name of Moses to, including Ramses. That Messi's part is the same root as Moses. And so here we're going to see Moses kind of begin to rise as a leader, all happening really, really quick. Oh, I did have this part here. Okay, yeah, we already said that. So these are the 3 names. This is the same person. Ruel, Jethro, and Hobab. I think this is from Judges. They're all the same person, but it's Moses' father-in-law. And he's a priest of God, even though that's not spelled right. We were going to read Exodus 3 and 4, but I am going to hope that you did read it and you do remember it. And so we will skip over reading it together. So in Exodus 3, God is going to appear to Moses in the burning bush. And so our big Bible term for this is a theophany. A theophany is theo, God, and theophany is like from seeing or eyes. And it's one way that we see God. And God is going to reveal God's own name. And the translations that we get of this is, I am who I am. We're going to play part of a video that's going to explain that name. And here, Moses is going to be given all of these different signs to kind of prove to Moses that he actually is the one God has chosen to go to the Hebrews. And he's instructed to go back to Pharaoh and demand their release. And this is all going to take place on Mount Sinai. And we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail, but I'm going to look at chapter 4. Oh, I guess I decided to go ahead and do it now. Okay, just kidding, we'll do it now. So here, we're going to learn about the name Yahweh. And so this is how it's written in Hebrew. This is what it looks like, if you were ever curious. If you ever hear the word tetragrammaton, it means the 4 letters. That is what some people, instead of saying Yahweh, they'll say tetragrammaton to refer to the 4 letters. Other times people will say the holy name, or in place of it, they'll say Lord with capital letters or just God. Because if you're a Jew, you don't actually speak God's name. It comes from the root word in Hebrew that means to be or to exist. And so the way that we kind of translate that is I am who I am, or I am that I am, or I am the one who is, / will be, / always was. And you can kind of just think of it as the one, or allness, or wholeness, or existing. And so it's kind of a powerful name. And we're going to play part of this Bible Project video.
For thousands of years, every morning and evening, Jewish people have prayed these well-known words as a way of expressing their devotion to God. They're called the Shema. Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. And as for you, you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your strength. We're going to look at the second key word here, Lord, written in all capital letters. This is the personal name of Israel's God. We first learn the meaning of this name in the story of Moses and the burning bush in the book of Exodus chapter 3. God appears to Moses and he commissions him to liberate the Israelites from slavery. And so Moses wonders, what if people ask the name of the God who has sent me? And so God responds, tell them, Ehyeh has sent me to you. Now, that Hebrew word, Ehyeh, means I will be. In other words, God's name means that he is the one who is and who will be. God's existence doesn't depend on anyone or anything else. This God simply is. But it will sound kind of strange for Moses to go say to the Israelites, I will be has sent me to you. Only God can say, I will be. So in the next sentence, God tells Moses the version he should say aloud. Yahweh, the God of our ancestors, he has sent me to you. Now, that word Yahweh is the ancient Hebrew form of the verb he will be. And this is the personal name of the God of Israel. It appears over 6,500 times in the Old Testament. Now, here's what's interesting. Over the centuries, Israelites wanted to honor them.
So he's going to talk about then how that name changes in etymology and why we say Jehovah today and why it's spelled the way that it is. But what's really special about this name, I am who I am, or I am the one who is it's a very universal name. So one thing about ancient gods, most of those ancient gods would be set to a specific area. So they would be the god of this thing, or they would be the god of this place. Or they could be some kind of cosmic god that has kind of died out or isn't involved in the world. So like the god of the heavens, or the god of like the ocean, or something that's kind of big, but they're not involved in the world. What makes Yahweh, this God, different than any other God is not only is he a big and cosmic God that's over all things, but he is a universal God over all places and over all peoples, and a good God. And so not some kind of controlling megalomaniac, but a God that actually cares about people and is involved in the world for its betterment. And so this God is different than any other God that's around, which makes this God very special. And while this is like the God of the Hebrews' ancestors, this is a God for all people, which is going to pop up with this line about God-fearers. So when it mentioned like those midwives feared God, and later we're going to hear about Pharaoh not fearing God, that is a term of people who are not Jewish, but they worship the Jews' God. It's used in the 6th century BCE, but we're seeing kind of traces of it here. This is the God for everyone. And so Yahweh is a very, very special God.
I've never thought of it that way when you think of the God of the Egyptians. They're many, but each one of them is limited.
Yes, yeah.
Whereas the God we have is unlimited.
and not only big, but also small.
Yeah.
Which makes, they're very special and very different. And so, yeah, Yahweh is a special God. Because usually they're either like small and more personal and more spirit-like, or they're like big and cosmic and off and out. And this God is both. And so, yeah, makes it very special. Questions about that name of God?
So what did you say Jehovah was interpreted from?
Jehovah, so in Hebrew you only have the consonants, there's no vowels. So because they never said the name Yahweh, they ended up forgetting how it sounded. And so, because they would say something else in place of it. And so they ended up taking the vowels from Adonai, which is the word Lord, and they placed it inside of these. And then the way that sounded out, if you went through German into English, was Jehovah. But that's taking the vowels from Adonai. And so, like, there's the two E's and the O in the middle.
So at that time they would not say the
No.
word Yahweh.
No, they would say Lord. They would replace it with Adonai or Elohim, which just means God. So usually in your Bible, if you see capital Lord, like in all capital letters, that is Yahweh. Which in the Hebrew is still like this. Oh, here it is. When the Hebrews added the vowels from Adonai, it was Yehovah. But that Y sound, when it goes into German to English, goes Je. And so it became Jehovah. It's like an English transliteration of that. But it all, so like Jehovah is trying to be Yahweh. It's just a different way of pronouncing it. Yahweh is a special God. What we're going to continue to see throughout the biblical narrative is this God is bigger than the Hebrews. And it's a God for all people. And we're really about to see that when the 10 plagues happen. Like God beats out the other gods, which is just, it gets really fun. It's exciting.
But the other gods aren't real gods.
No, I'm using like little g's, little g gods. And so this, we're going to come back to this part in chapter 3 about Moses kind of testing God or his insecurities at least. But so Moses continues to share his problems. So he's like, well, I can't speak. I think, no. Did you bring this up about Moses having his problems with God?
That's
Yeah, okay. And so, so God's going to continue to give these kind of miraculous signs. And so one of them is that he is going to turn his staff into a snake. And so that he can kind of prove himself, like, yes, Moses, you are the one I'm going to send. And then Moses is like, but I can't even talk. I have a stutter or something. And so they're going to send Aaron to go and be his spokesperson. And so now Moses and Aaron are going to return with this message. So I want to talk about this. The first part is that Moses here in chapters 3 and 4 is presented as a prophet. And so we talked about this in Genesis, that Exodus and Genesis are written last. And so even though there's like the prophets come later, like in history, than Moses and Abraham, there's these words that were written first. And a prophet always starts with this line of, here I am, send me. And so whenever you hear this line, here I am, this is someone being prophetic. They are offering themselves to God to be used. And so this scene starts with Moses saying, here I am. And so he is, even though it doesn't call him a prophet, he is being displayed as a prophet. And I just want to, as a reminder, we are all called to be God's prophets. We are all called to speak God's message and God's gospel. And we are all called to that as part of being the covenant of becoming the blessing for the world. And so Moses brings up these 4 problems that he has of why he can't do this thing. He says, I'm unworthy to do it. I'm not good enough. And then he's like, well, I don't even know who you are. What name do I call you? I don't know how to describe you to other people. And then he's like, well, no one is going to listen to me. And then he says, well, I can't even speak that well. And I think all of us have these own kinds of insecurities where we think, yeah, well, I'm unworthy for this, or I don't know how to describe you to other people. or no one's going to listen to me anyway. And even if they would listen, I can't even speak. And so my question for you, and maybe think about it inside, we won't share it today, is what problems maybe stop you from being this prophet for God, or stop you from coming to God? Because I think Moses, for me in this story, becomes really relatable. So like for me, when I was younger, I was really bad at public speaking, and it's still something that makes me nervous, even if I'm in front of like 5 people. And I very easily stumble on my words, and so I really relate to Moses. And apparently when I speak, sometimes I make up words. And my brain freezes, and I like can't speak English for some reason. And I practice all this in the mirror before, like in the mornings, I practice everything we're gonna say, and I still mess up when I'm kind of in front of people. So I relate to Moses here, but like a younger Alexander would absolutely freak out and would just melt down being in front of people. So doing things like this is one thing that for me takes a lot of bravery. And so my hope is we can be like Moses and come to God with our problems. And usually God's there to reassure us. And it's not that we are awesome, it's that God is awesome and God can use anyone. So that's our little devotional tidbit for today. We're not going to read Exodus 5. I will trust that you read it and also remember it. But what happens there is that then Moses and Aaron do go before Pharaoh. And there they're going to request this 3-day journey. I've always found the story to be a little strange, where they're like, let us take all of Israel out in the desert so that we can go make a sacrifice to God. And understandably, this just makes Pharaoh mad. And so he refuses, and he gives them harsher punishments and a harsher workload. And so what ends up happening is that obviously the Hebrews get upset because they can't meet these demands. And you can't make brick without straw. It's an impossible demand. And so they begin to blame Moses and Aaron for increasing their own suffering and hardship. And so sometimes when we are called by God, things don't look like they're going well at first, and things can look really hard. And so my encouragement from looking at this story is maybe when you find yourself on your own calling of God, and at first you're like, well, I'm making it worse. This is not getting any better. Just wait. God knows the bigger picture than we do. And the other thing about this is Moses is going to go to Pharaoh and demand, let my people go. And this is repeated 7 times in all of Exodus, which again, we get that special number of 7. And so the other thing that Pharaoh is going to say here is, I don't know Yahweh. I don't know that God. And so my question for us is, do we know God? Like, do we know this God that we have? And Exodus kind of presents this idea of knowing God, which is that we are looking for and seeing the things that God does, and then we respond with obedience, trust in God or faith, and praise. And when Pharaoh says this line, I don't know God, it's really starting Pharaoh on a different trajectory than Yahweh. And so what we're going to continue to see is he is in stark opposition to what Yahweh is going to do. Also, this is an interesting note, and I forget where I actually read this, but Pharaoh says this line, thus says Pharaoh, is what they quote him saying, which just grammatically is very similar to when a prophet begins a statement, thus says the Lord. And so here again, we're kind of seeing Pharaoh is putting himself up against God. And they're the ones that are going to duel it out. So I want to show you all this song. This is it's a silly song. We're not going to listen to all of it. But so, let my people go. Man, I had a lot of typos. Golly, I was kind of like half sick when I made this PowerPoint. So, let me people go. So when I grew up like going to like youth camp and stuff, there was a song that we would sing. We go, Pharaoh, Pharaoh, oh, let my people go. So I wanted to find a version of it, and I found one. And so this is that, and I hope you will remember this statement now. I really hope this is stuck in your head. So, what'd you say?
Don't stop.
Well, no, that is that song. I never realized it was actually a song.
Louie Louie?
I just knew that.
Yeah.
Wait, who is it?
Louie Louie.
Wait, is this a real song?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah. So I only knew the chorus, and then I looked it up, and I was like, oh, I didn't know. And the song goes through the like the whole Moses story. So we might come back to this when we get to chapter 18 at the covenant part. So
I think
That's
that
cute.
was a little bit of a risque song at the time when it came out, back when we were.
Oh,
Wasn't
So-
there a little something risque about it?
Well,
I probably didn't get whatever it was.
I'm having fun preparing fun little songs for us to listen to, and I can't wait to get to the Keith Green one. I mentioned it last week.
Yeah.
So I want to remember that line, Pharaoh, let my people go. Because that's the message that Moses has. And so imagine though for Moses, like it's a silly song, but how scary that would be to go up to the Pharaoh and demand, let my people go. And so my hope is you remember that we are also prophets like Moses. And so we can demand that too. And that's true for all people experiencing oppression, that we can be the advocates. Okay, that's Exodus 1 through 5. The Shemot, or name. So next week, we're going to go to Exodus 6 through 9, which I'm not even going to try to say whatever that word is. But the English is, and I appeared. Because I don't know what Viera, I don't know that. But any final kind of questions as we come to a close on what we looked at so far, or things that were special to you?
Great job.
That song.
I'm glad that
Does Jim
like
Garvey do that one?
No, we should like plug it into the speakers one day. Like,
I bet
Don't
she knows
expect us to
Louis,
get up
right?
in front of it.
we could get our class in front of the church and like sing with the kids. I'm glad that you guys accept my strange humor of weird things.
You know, I think that, I guess I thought, maybe I misread it, but I thought the